Last time when
Yeah.
we met, we went over some of the basic principles of Ribbis. We got through some of them and wanted to cover some more today. And hopefully this will give a little bit of a backdrop, a landscape for just delving into Hilchos Ribbis further over the course of the year. It's interesting because I don't know, this is hashgacha, sort of serendipitous. Over the last couple of weeks, I've had a plethora of Ribbis shilos that have been coming into the office. It's been sort of nonstop. I don't know if the memo got out that we're learning Hilchos Ribbis this year in the Kol LHoraah. Just this past hour, somebody called me up. He's in a business, a merchant cash advance business, and they only make loans to non-Jews because they charge interest. They don't want to charge interest to Jewish borrowers. So some fellow that represented that he was not Jewish, although he had a Jewish sounding name, so they were suspicious, but he represented that he was not Jewish, so they made the loan to him, and he paid, and there was ribbis, and they collected. Then afterwards, he turned to them and he said, "You know what? I lied to you. I'm really Jewish, and I want the money back." So they did some research, and sure enough, everything checked out in terms of his yichus. I don't know if they got a bezin involved to do a bira yadus, but it turned out that he was unambiguously, unquestionably, indubitably Jewish. And and the shaila this fellow had was, do I have to return the money that I already received? He said he has three partners. The other two sounded like they might be from him as well. So the other two partners asked their rabbanim, and they found some heterim for them. He wanted to know what the story was with himself. So I said, listen, the borrower was their personal liability, or maybe it was only shibun nechasim if it wasn't personal liability. So you can argue it's no worse than ribbis rabbanim. Maybe under those circumstances, with this fellow who ripped them off and bamboozled them or fooled them, maybe you could be a little bit makel on Latzes Kidei Shemaim, returning of Ribbis D'Rabbanan. So he said, no, there was a personal liability. So I said, well, maybe there is a shita. After all, we try to avoid reliance upon it, that you can loan Ribbis to somebody who's a mumar. So I said the poskim generally assume this only applies to a shanu pirish, somebody who started out from and then he kind of left the fold. So when you say this fellow's in that category, so they didn't do enough research, but it seemed like the fellow just he wasn't religious. He was it was never religious. Essentially a tinok shenishba, but clearly unambiguously Jewish. I said, okay, so probably don't have that heter to rely upon either. So I said, look, according to some poskim, there's a Taz that says that Ribbis Ketsutza is only Yotza B'dayanim if the person actually requests it. They don't request it, so maybe you don't have to return it, but here he clearly requested it. So I said, so he said, so am I stuck? Do I have to return it? I have to return everything? I said, well, no, you get a break. You don't have to return everything. You should return the Ribbis. But you don't have to return the principal. So he was very relieved. He thought that if he has to return everything, including the principal. So he was very relieved. At least he doesn't have to hand back the principal. He doesn't have to suffer net loss. But he said, this was the part I told him I'm not really sure about. That he said, my partners, since they got out of it because they said they got some sort of a dispensation not to have to return their part. So do I have to, since we're all in the partnership together, do I have to return their share as well? So I said, right now, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think you all kind of have your own distinct shares in the business. But I said I wasn't as clear about that one. But I said I don't think so. But okay. Anyway, that was the shiloh that I got within the past hour. Mamish the past hour. Very interesting shilohs. Okay. Anyway, obviously all these things should be mulled over, and I appreciate other thoughts. Now, one very important principle we mentioned last time was loas Torah and the ribbis above milove lemalve. So we discussed, okay, who's a malve, who's a love, but of course, what's considered to be ribbis. So there are a lot of different factors that go into what's ribbis. Klal ribisa kolago neter is also any the delay in receiving money that is charged for with a premium. So we discussed that's basically a ribbis, a penalty amount. We said it isn't strictly ribbis, but it's haramas ribbis. But there's another question. What if the person who borrowed the money just decides they're going to throw in a little bit extra as a gift? What that means, what does a gift mean? Now, obviously, if it wasn't Ribbis Kitzutza, then it's not Ribbis Deraisa, but anytime you're paying a little bit extra because of the fact that you're paying off a loan a little bit later, you're paying the money later than when you received it. That's Ribbis by definition. What do you mean a matana? Matana means that you figure in your head, I like this fellow, I would have given him a matana anyway, so I'll give him a matana now. Since I'm paying back a loan anyway, I'll throw in a matana. It doesn't sound convincing. Most of the time, we'll assume that's haramis ribbis. So it's Mexican ribbis. Mexican ribbis. Some say it's a different category than haramis ribbis, but certainly Mexican ribbis. It looks a lot like ribbis. So it's something which we don't which we don't permit. When it comes to ribbis mukdemes, ribbis mucheres, in Simon Kov Samech, that you give something a little bit early or something a little bit late, then you don't specify that it's for the purpose of a loan. It's like you're giving you're giving something a little bit earlier or later without giving any kind of a specification that it's related, and it's only a small amount. So then the Ramah indicates there's room to be make over here, even if it's only a small amount, and even if you don't open up your mouth, we assume that it's basically ribbis. If you said you're doing it for a matana, you might think that's better. Shulchan Aruch says no, that's also no good because we don't really believe you that you're doing it for matana purposes. Now, there's a kasha that the poskim all ask, which is that there's a halacha 9 hilchos ribbis. There's a halacha in Choshim Mishpah in Siman Reish Lamed Beis, which says that if a person discovers you paid for an item, and it's mashma from the context over there, tour, that it's even where we're talking about a borrower repaying a loan, and the person who received the money fumbles in their pocket, and they discover that it's more money than they were supposed to receive, and it's more than just the amount that a person might make a mistake about, so that it was clear that it was intentional. So the halach is eino tzorach lahachzir. So why is it that the halach is eino tzorach lahachzir in such a case? So the Taz says that if it's just included in everything else, so then it's clear that it wasn't a standalone amount. It's clear that this was intended as a matana bi'alma, but most of the poskim disagree with the Taz, and they give other terusim. The Shach's teretz is you have to explain. Even if the lashon hava is used there by some of the poskim, they don't mean hava. They mean mecher. There's room to be mekel in the context of a mechira transaction, even as the Ramah says in Siman Kuf Samech. If it's a mechira transaction, it's only ribbis drabanan anyway. We're a little bit more mekel. Certainly a little bit more mekel, according to Rabbi Kiva Hager, if it's a little bit of extra merchandise is thrown in as opposed to a little bit extra money. But okay, in this context where it's intended as a matana, and it's swallowed up, and it was already received. So the Shach says that's the reason we're mekel. The Chavaz Das has a very commonsensical explanation as to why it's mutter. He says not mutter. It's not mutter. Of course, it's not mutter. But what are we talking about over here? We're talking about something which is Mexican ribbis. It's basically in the category of haramis ribbis, just like the ribbis mukdemis and ribbis mucheres. When a person says that they're giving a little extra before the loan, they're giving a little extra matana after the loan. So we say that when it's sort of specified what the reason is that they're giving the matana because of the loan, so we say. So that's a problem of haramis ribbis. So here, even if you don't open up your mouth, and it's only a small amount, but it's at the time of the payment of the loan. And certainly if it was before the payment of the loan, so then in this particular case, we're going to treat it in that same category as ribbis mukdemis or ribbis mucheres. Ribbis mukdemis or ribbis mucheres is the lowest form of Issa ribbis, basically what we call in the category of haramis ribbis, and therefore if a person received it, they're not obligated to return it, even let's say sidei shemayim. So says the Chavaz Das, that's what's going on over here. It's not mutter. It's not mutter. This really is a problem of ribbis. Okay, so there are different levels of ribbis. Ribbis daraisa, vak ribbis, Mexican ribbis, the haramis ribbis is a low level of ribbis, but it's still going to be prohibited. It's just that under these circumstances, it wouldn't be, if this was the shiloh that I got, I would have said, okay, you threw in a little extra, you didn't charge for it, so maybe there's room that you don't have to return it. So that's basically what his explanation is. Some say that this really does count as a vak ribbis, but that's a standard explanation with respect to this case. What the Chavaz Das is really getting at is there are no real heterim to figure out clever ways that you're going to add some extra money. And in fact, the one heter that the Shulchan Aruch has in this regard, regarding the Talmidei Chachamim, that's in Siftei Zayin, the Talmidei Chachamim are allowed to borrow from each other, Dvarim Shel Machol. And this is, again, not even talking about money, because money looks more suspicious. But if it's Dvarim Shel Machol, and they return a little bit extra Machol more than what they received, Ad Chomish, there's not a ridiculous amount. So we assume that Talmidei Chachamim can be trusted that it was really l'shem matana, and therefore that's going to be mutar shedavar yedua shelo nasan lo matana. But you require that if both the parties be Talmidei Chachamim. Number two, the Ramah says, Lo yagilu Talmidei Chachamim atzmim v'kach. The Talmidei Chachamim should not accustom themselves to do this. And number three, the Shita Mikobetzis says that this is not applicable for the most part nowadays, unless you're dealing with Talmidei Chachamim muflogim harbe, you're dealing with tremendously well-renowned Talmidei Chachamim who are exceptional in their midos, and we generally assume that we don't quite qualify for this category. But what we see is that if Lu Yitzir, you would be able to determine that some extra amount really wasn't being given for Ribbis purposes. Ribbis purposes meaning because of appreciation for the fact that the lender extended the loan, and that's why you're throwing in some extra. So if it is, if it's something where it appears that it is being done very clearly for another purpose, so then there might be room to be matir. Like, for example, the borrower is reimbursing the lender for their out-of-pocket costs, because it cost the lender some money. They had to travel somewhere in order to retrieve the money. They're charging their gas costs. It's the out-of-pocket costs. Out-of-pocket costs, so we say that's not considered to be ribbis. That's just a reimbursement of an out-of-pocket cost. Reimbursement of the fact that the lender did a big favor by loaning the money, that's called ribbis. But out-of-pocket costs, so okay, that's considered to be a legitimate thing. So Mashal Zalman Auerbach explores the following question, and I think he's really a yachid when it comes to this. I haven't really found anybody else, but it's a published tshuva, so I've included it, but I find it really a curiosity. I don't think that it's anything that anyone relies upon. Lamaisa, he says, what if there wasn't any kind of obviously stipulated ribbis, but the lover didn't pay on time? The lover paid late, and he feels bad that he paid late. We said that even a one-time penalty payment would be also as a haramis ribbis, so there's no penalty payment. The lender's not asking for a penalty, but the borrower of his own volition wants to just reimburse the lender, so not reimburse, but give him some extra money so he shouldn't complain about the borrower. Oh, you cost me so much agmas nefesh or lost profit, whatever it was, because you didn't return the money on time. So the borrower, therefore, in order to dispel any kind of a grievance, any kind of a teromis, he wants to pay something extra that he shouldn't be viewed as a kafui tova, that he didn't pay back his loan on time. So says the Mincha Shlomo, source 4 over here. It's true, the Ma'alveh can't ask him for any kind of money to pay him back for his agmas nefesh, about mistaber, but it stands to reason. The lover wants to be losses sidei shemayim, he could throw in something extra to mollify the Ma'alveh for his trouble. Losses sidei shemayim shapim mutar lo litain mamon l'Ma'alveh u'ledvatil es hataromis sheyesh lo alav sharei lo asur Torah ribbis ela behova shehova shalova nos in the Ma'alveh meritzono atov. It's only the ribbis is only prohibited when it's some extra money that the lover is paying over to the Ma'alveh. Lo iku piron shel lover, but not for delayed payment of the lover that the Ma'alveh is not even asking for. Even if the amount that he's paying is based on what a normal interest rate would have been for the late payment of the loan. It's a very, if he brings a riot from the Gemara in Marcos, but it's a very fascinating thing, because pretty much everybody says not so. And not only that, but the Chelkas Binyamin, when he quotes this notion, and he says explicitly that you're not allowed, the borrower is not allowed to volunteer payment to the lender in order to compensate him for his trouble when the borrower pays late, because that's also in the category of ribbis. So he says, and this is something which is said over in the name of Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So he quotes Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach himself as standing for this proposition, which I find to be a little bit of a curiosity, since I don't know, unless my eyes are deceiving me, Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach here seems to be matter this, but everybody says it's a pella. It's so much of a pella that in most of the Ribbis, of the Hilchos Ribbis compendiums, that you probably have acquired or you're looking at and so forth, you'll be hard-pressed to find the Shita of Shlomo Zalman quoted altogether. I found it intriguing that the one place where I found him quoted about this, he's quoted as saying exactly the opposite, but it's generally assumed not this way, because this really seems to fall much more in the definition of what we worry about is being given really l'shem ribbis. It's not to say that it's not l'shem ribbis if you just want the malva not to have a tarumis. L'maisa, it's much more difficult than justifying a matana, which a Talmid Chacham, we assume, would have given to his friend, the Talmid Chacham, anyway. Here it's quite clear that the money wouldn't have been paid anyway, and therefore this, we assume, is in fact problematic. But the much more common case where the poskim are makel is where you have either a suffix, where a person's not sure of how much money he owes. He's not sure. There are a bunch of friends that go out for dinner, and one person puts the bill, and they're trying to figure out exactly how much each person owed in terms of what they bought and the taxes and the tip. It's kind of difficult to figure out the allocation. So instead of driving themselves crazy mathematically, so one person says, look, I'll round up a little bit. We're not sure exactly how much I owe, but I'll round up a little bit. So we'll make sure that I pay I'll pay at least as much as I owe. And if I pay a little bit more, it won't be the end of the world. If somebody doesn't remember how much they borrowed, maybe they borrowed $30, maybe they borrowed $50. So to be on the safe side, I'll pay $50. Or a Bezdin is adjudicating a case. And a Bezdin is adjudicating a loan case, and they have to figure out, does the borrower owe $30? Does the borrower owe $50? There's an argument to say he owes 30. There's an argument to say that he owes 50. Different evidence pointing this way or that way. So the Bezdin says, we'll make up pshara, $40. We'll pay $40. But if the loan amount was really $30, so now they're being mechayev in ribbis. So Avnei Nezer says that's not ribbis. If it's being charged because it's a suffix, then maybe this amount, Me'ikar Adin, is really owed, or somebody is paying a little bit extra because maybe Me'ikar Adin, he really owes the amount. So then the Minchas Yitzchak says, based on the Avnei Nezer, that this wouldn't be a problem of ribbis at all. But going back to the question that we discussed regarding ribbis l'shem matana, so he says like this. He says that maybe under these circumstances, well, there are a couple of eitzos that the Avnei Nezer has. So one eitzah that the Avnei Nezer has is that l'rav chalamilsa yuchal lefasher sheyimchol amav kochov ribbis sheyesh alav. That again, in this particular case, let's say it's a Bezdin case where the Bezdin is being mechayev somebody $40, and according to the borrower, he really only owes $30, and the lender says $50. We say in the event that there would be some sort of a ribbis argument as to why this money is being paid. So we have the lender waive any right that he might have, any payment, any charging of ribbis that he might have done inadvertently. So that's sort of one way of avoiding the problem. And another way of avoiding the problem is to stipulate that if there is any kind of extra amount that is being paid, so it's being done l'shem matana. That in this particular case, saying, remember, if it really deep down, it would be l'shem matana. So l'shem matana would be perfectly permissible. So in this, like with the Talmidei Chachamim, so in this particular case, so where we have a heter anyway, because the person is paying based on the fact that there is a suffix. So then there's more of an argument to say that we'll throw in Eliezer says that it's going to be given l'shem matana. Okay, so that's one manifestation where it actually would make sense to rely upon this idea. You take a look at the materials of page 2. He says that L'Ravcha de Milsa, it's the second line of the last paragraph. L'Ravcha de Milsa Yoma Lova L'Malve Timeinu Chaya Lo Kesikim Shenose Lo Yeh B'Toras Matana. Then it should be given over B'Toras Matana. Now, what about the other case? The other case where the borrower, let's say, the Minchas Yitzchak discusses, is prepared to pay an amount that he owes to the lender, but he doesn't have exact change. Let's say that I sent somebody to the store to buy me some lunch because I was hungry, and there's a place right here on Howard Street in where the CRC is located. You go 100 feet or so, and there's a nice dairy restaurant. So I send somebody who's going there anyway to buy lunch for himself. I say, get me a soup. And the soup, let's say, is $5.98. And he comes back and he says, okay, it costs $5.98. He essentially loaned me that money in order to buy the soup for me. So I look in my pocket, I have a $5 bill and I have a $1 bill. I don't have exact change. Maybe I have 50 cents or whatever. I don't have exact change. So it's much easier for me to just kind of round it off and give the person $6. So is that considered to be permissible? So it's interesting. The Minchas Yitzchak himself says, and maybe the sort of the case is where the lender doesn't have exact change. If he would have exact change, so I would take the exact change, but he doesn't have exact change. He doesn't have 2 pennies. So I say, okay, so I'll give you just the $6 instead. So the Minchas Yitzchak says that, and there's a paragraph here that got cut off, actually, for some reason when I was copying and pasting. So the paragraph says that if we're dealing with simply a case that the lover doesn't want to be matriach, that he's giving some extra mitam, it's not for the purpose of a matana that we have to argue is the matana sincere or not. He just doesn't want to trouble himself to search for more money until he has he doesn't want to take the time to find the exact amount of money. Maybe he could. Maybe if he looked in his wallet, he'd be able to come up with 98 cents, but he doesn't want to bother himself. So since the lender doesn't have to change anyway, it's easier for him. It's easier for him. He's saving himself from the tircha. It's not that he wants to give him a ton, he's just saving himself from tircha. So he says that Kamal Lamot the Dugma, if the person would drop the 2 pennies on the ground, he wouldn't go searching for the 2 pennies. There are people who would go searching. Maybe this halacha doesn't apply to them. But for those people who wouldn't go searching for the 2 pennies, he's giving it as a matana, so he thinks that should be perfectly fine. So some of the poskim, including the Chalkas Mechokek, including Rabbi Reisman and his sefer, so when they're sort of, I guess, quoting from this Minchas Yitzchak, they say, yeah, if the way the Chalkas Mechokek puts it is, if the general minhag is to round anyway, I go to the store and the teller, the cashier, when I'm going to the supermarket, owes me $2 in change, and owes me $1.99 in change, and she has $2 and I don't have a penny, she'll say, it's okay, take the $2. She doesn't care about that extra penny. People aren't makbid about that. They round all the time. So if the idea is people round all the time, so they say, you don't really have to worry about it. That's perfectly okay, because this is just sort of the general conduct people would do in any kind of a payment circumstance. So it's not because of the extension, because the person waited a little bit to get paid back, that I'm giving this extra money. It's understood that people in general round. But what the Minchas Yitzchak actually says is, even though this is a good svara, that only works if this amount is considered to be trivial, both from the perspective of the borrower and from the perspective of the lender. Maybe from the perspective of the lender, 2 pennies is not considered to be trivial. So therefore, he says that just to be on the safe side, the borrower should say to the lender, give the extra amount at tzedakah. That's what he actually says. So you could say, well, we'll distinguish between 2 different types of cases, that where it's the borrower sort of on his own, volunteering that, I don't want to bother myself, so I'll just give you $1 and I don't really care about change. So then maybe you could be makel not to require that the extra amount be given to tzedakah, like the later poskim seem to say. But if it was a case where the borrower had asked the lender for change and the lender just said, I don't have change, and only then is the borrower saying, oh, keep the change, so then that's a little bit more dicey, because it seemed like the borrower really did want the money back originally. So that's more questionable. So maybe b'dafka in that case, you should be makbid to require that it be given to tzedakah. That would seem to be perhaps the reading of some of the later poskim. But as I'm saying, if you read, it's a famous Minchas Yitzchak, because everybody quotes it. If you look at the Minchas Yitzchak inside, he doesn't actually seem to have 3 cases. He only really seems to have 2 cases. He doesn't really seem to differentiate between the case where the borrower is saying it on his own because he doesn't want to trouble himself, and where the borrower had actually asked the lender for change, and the lender didn't have change. Now, why is it a solution in this particular case to give it tzedakah? I can understand matana. Strictly speaking, if we know that something was only for matana, has nothing to do with a loan, so strictly speaking, that would have been mutter. So I understand doing that in the case where there's a suffix. You'll say, oh, any extra that I might give is going to be for purposes of matana. And we want the person, the other party, to hold on to that money because maybe they're really entitled to the money. Here, in this case, we know how much the lender is entitled to, and we don't necessarily want the lender to end up with more money because there's no suffix over here. Lender's getting more than he was entitled to. So in this case, we understand that we say something different. We say, give the money to tzedakah. Why does that help? Normally, if a lender loans money to a borrower, we mentioned this already, and he says to the borrower, I want you to pay me back the principal, and I want you to pay interest, but don't pay the interest to me. Pay the interest to Ploni. Pay the interest to a non-Jew. Pay the interest to tzedakah. It doesn't make a difference. Interest is interest. Even if I direct that the borrower pay it to somebody else, that's still going to be prohibited interest. So why then is this going to be permitted in this particular context? So the Minchas Yitzchak has an interesting explanation for this. He says that even though normally, if in a regular loan situation, if you are stipulating an amount to be paid, you wouldn't be allowed to do that if it was be Ribbis Milcheres. So he says, Ein Isser. Therefore, he says that this particular case is no worse than that. It's sort of as we said, the adding on extra at the time of payment would be sort of in the same category when it's not being said to be for the purpose of Ribbis. And he says that not only that, but there's a Radbaz that goes so far as to say that B'shas Hova, you can even direct that extra money to be given to stock, and even though we hold that that's Mamish Ribbis, so we wouldn't rely upon that. But he said in this particular case, which is essentially a Ribbis Milcheres case, he says, Kiel od me avak Ribbis, which is even more kal than avak Ribbis, bevada yesh lahakil. That's the reason why he makes this suggestion, which would otherwise be a curious suggestion of stipulating that the extra amount be given to stock. But as I mentioned, I saw both in Rabbi Reisman, the Chalkas Binyamin, they don't have that particular requirement when it's like a very trivial amount that people would be more likely to round off anyway. I'm just mentioning that Lemaisa, the Minchas Yitzchak, actually seems to be machmir about this. So that's in terms of the definition that we see that if the money is being given really for any other good and legitimate reason, other than paying a premium on the loan, so there is a room to be makel, but we just don't trust people in terms of their intentions. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has this, what seems to be a wild kula in this particular case, but as I said, this is not generally relied upon in terms of compensating a lender for the fact that they had to wait for payment of the loan. Maybe he's assuming that if it's a one-time compensation, it's similar to like a knas case. And since we're the Ribbis, a knas case, we're only machmir based on haramis Ribbis anyway. So when it wasn't a stipulated knas and the borrower was paying on his own, maybe that's the reason why he feels that he could be more meko. But as I said, that's not really halacha l'maisa.
I remember my quick question. I remember my kids
Yes.
learning this halacha l'chumra in high school about borrowing from neighbors and then paying them back. And I always wanted to know, why couldn't you characterize the extra few pennies as just a fee for the service of getting the groceries, or in the Rav's case, the soup?
Right. So if it's in the context of a mecher transaction, so then we actually are a little bit more mako. But in the soup case, it's not viewed as a mecher transaction per se. He's not selling me the soup. He bought the soup for me. But if he would have bought the soup, if he would have bought the soup for himself, so then it'll be more of a mecher transaction. But it's generally assumed, no, he bought the soup for me and he's basically loaning me the money. So that's
he
really
did the schlepping.
complete loan.
But
Schlepping. So if there's a schlepping,
it's a DoorDash fee.
Yeah. So if a person would typically charge money for schlepping, so then that might be okay. But if a person wouldn't typically charge money for schlepping, so then it's much more difficult to justify. That's why I say that for out-of-pocket costs, it's much easier to be makel than for schlepping costs. Like a person actually had to spend money on gas. Okay, so that's a little bit easier to justify than under these circumstances. Okay.
What would Rabbi say about keeping the change by when it's being split by Venmo or electronic payment, Zelle, and for no real reason, people just round up 35 cents or whatever it is. They split the ride and they know exactly to the penny what it is, and it's not very hard to press the button. They just round up just because.
It's a very good question. So the Chelkas Binyamin says that when the minhag Medina is that people just round up, whether it be a loan transaction, purchase transaction, anything you do in life, You just round up. People round because it's just easier to keep track of your finances by rounding up. That's what everybody does. So then there's more room to be makel. That's what he seems to indicate. Again, it would have to be rounded up within reason. As I said, if I go to the store, I go to the cashier, this is not a Ribbis transaction, even b'toras mecher. I'm paying for the item right now. And the person's just giving me change, and they see that I don't have, sometimes they don't even ask me. If it's $1, they owe me $1.98, okay? And they'll just give me a $2 bill. They won't even ask me for 2 pennies. They won't ask me for the 2 pennies. It's just done. That's the minhag Medina. So if it's something within that range, I think there's room to be made. But I think once you get beyond 2-3 pennies, then it already becomes questionable. And maybe then they really, look, if you made a stipulation that it should be given to tzedakah, the problem there is, what if the person doesn't give it to tzedakah? So it would have to be sort of an understanding that it's actually going to go to tzedakah. Unless you say to the person, next time you give tzedakah, so it'll be understood that the dollar bill that you're giving includes the 20 cents extra that you got over here. So maybe that could work. Okay, next category that's very, very important is we discussed it a little bit, but not, it's sort of, honing in on it. We spoke about who's a malvin, who's a lobe, in terms of shibud aguf, shibud nechasim, in terms of, as the balim yuduim, like the Rashba. But there's another very important point, of course, that's at the beginning of the whole Shulchan Aruch presentation, Hilchos Ribbis and Siman Kuf Nun Tes, l'nachli sashach, that if it's a non-Jew, that you're either borrowing from or you're lending to, so then all bets are off. That may, according to Rama, may even be a positive commandment. If you're going to loan money to a non-Jew, you have to charge ribbis. But at the very least, it's certainly a lavabah michlal essay that we learn. This is an additional pasuk teaching that you're not allowed to lend interest to a Jew, only to a non-Jew. So michlal heina tashemea lav. But this is an extremely important general principle because so much of what Chazal came up with, certainly prior to the days of Heter Iska, and you go to Siman Kuf Samach, which Mi'etz Hashem will devote more time to as the year goes on, you'll see that there's so much cleverness that was developed in terms, or that was applied to different types of transactions, taking advantage of the fact that if the loan is really coming from a non-Jew, really is going to a non-Jew, then it is considered to be a permissible transaction. So you have all kinds of configurations where there's a Jew in the middle, there's a Jew who extends money to a non-Jew, and then the non-Jew extends money to another Jew, where there will be various permissible permutations, depending on who bears the achrayas and who doesn't bear the achrayas, and certain prohibited permutations of these various dinim. Is there a reliance on a mashkon, not a reliance on a mashkon? But a lot of it really revolves around this issue. And it's before you get to all those complicated scenarios, which of course we're not going into right now, there is sort of the fundamental question of, I know that I'm Jewish, right? I think I'm Jewish, right? I know everybody here, you're all Jewish. It's great. We can't loan money to each other with interest. That's clear. I go outside and I go to certain sections of this neighborhood and I kind of know who's not Jewish as well. Okay, that's when I'm dealing with human beings. Sometimes I have a question about somebody. I have to do a bir yadus, like the phone call that I got. Okay, sometimes it's not as clear. But usually we can make a simple determination. Is this person Jewish? Is this person not Jewish? But I'm not dealing with a person. I'm dealing with an entity. We mentioned the Heter of Moshe, that if the entity is borrowing money, it could be a whole bunch of Jews all together. They're all Jewish, but they only have shibud nechasim, not shibud aguf. And he's makel about that. And the other poskim hold that that's not Ribbis deraisa, but it's going to be Ribbis derabbanan. That's if you're the borrower. But Moshe admits that if it's a lender, if I have a corporation, he doesn't hold by the Heter of Rav Yona Reiss. If I have a corporation that is the lender that's making the loan, and it's a corporation of Jews, and I have another Jew on the other side who's the borrower, so that's Ribbis gomer. If interest has been, that's Ribbis gomer. It's a merchant lending association, or whatever it happens to be. But I have as a mortgage company, it's made up of Jews. They're extending a loan to an individual Jew. That's a Ribbis gomer. But the question is, what if this bank, this organization, this association, what if it's made up of a combination of Jews and not Jews? When is it that I say that it's Jewish? When is it that I say that it's not Jewish? Even in terms of the entity that's borrowing, assuming they're going to be machmir, not like Rav Moshe, at least to hold that it's Ribbis derabbanan. When do I define an entity as Jewish or as not Jewish? So an interesting source, and this is just, I identify it to you because this is used as sort of the major source, is a tshuva by Rav Moshe that has nothing to do with the subject. There are two things about this tshuva, and it's a very interesting thing. Number one, Rav Moshe tshuva has nothing to do with the subject of Ribbis. And number two, the conclusion that's derived from this tshuva of Rav Moshe doesn't seem to be exactly what he says, but it's a very interesting thing. From this tshuva of Rav Moshe, which is found in Even Ezra of all places, the end of a tshuva in Chelik Aleph Siman Zayin, Rav Moshe, there's a conclusion which is made by the poskim that we go after the majority. We go after the majority. Is it majority owned by Jews? Then it's a Jewish entity. If it's it minority owned by Jews, then it's a non-Jewish entity. What was the question posed by Rav Moshe? It was, can I own shares in a company that does business on Shabbos? Or am I guilty of doing Schorah b'Shabbos? That was the question that was posed to Rav Moshe. And Rav Moshe said, oh, well, the truth of the matter is you own shares in a company, you own nothing, you own garnished. You own the right to collect dividends. They don't care what you have to say. You don't really have any ownership interest in the company. They give you voting rights, which Minchas Yitzchak thought was significant. He says, the voting rights don't count for anything because they don't really care who you vote for. You don't really care who you're going to vote for. You own stocks and you get a prospectus in the mail. You get hundreds and hundreds of pages in the prospectus. What do? You do what everybody else does. You dump it in paper recycling. None of these things have any meaning to anybody. So therefore, he says, it's just pitume mili bialma, that they're giving you the right to vote for the president, vice president. You could care less about any of these things. You just want to make money off of the stocks. That's understood. That's a given. Then Rav Moshe says he has a line, a throwaway line, which doesn't even seem to be necessarily maskana of the tshuva or whatever. The throwaway line is, ki lemaise is pitume mili be'ama, ki lemaise mashivin le'atzmin yotzim erov. Because the ones who are really controlling the company are leaving for themselves more than the majority of the shares. Now, he goes on to say, on the other hand, if it turns out that you're going to have a very significant share in the company, he doesn't say 51%, I can have 15% share in the company where they're actually going to pay attention to what I have to say. They actually care about what I have to say. That's a different story. Then you have to worry about owning stock in that company if they're going to do business on Shabbos. That's the totality of the tshuva by Rav Moshe. So Rav Yosef Shalom El Yoshev Zeichat Tzadik Levacha was asked the question by the late Rav Shraga Feibel Cohen and Zeichat Tzadik Levacha, passed away about a year ago or so. So Rav Feibel Cohen was very close to Rav Yoshev. Rav Yoshev held that whenever there was an important shaila psak to be asked in the United States, it should go to Rav Feibel Cohen. When we convened together a number of years ago to try to make emendations in the get law, in order to make it more palatable to Rav Yoshev, so there was a whole committee that was formed. This was around 1997 or so. That was like one of my first forays into the world of Bezdin. So I remember being part of this committee, and the major poskim in this committee were Rav Feibel Cohen, Rav Leibish Landesman, Rabbi Willig was part of it, and everybody was brainstorming what are the changes that can be made in the get law number 2, to make it palatable to Rav Yoshev. And the main person who was assigned to be the contact person with Rav Yoshev to share any of our suggestions and ideas with Rav Yoshev was, of course, Rav Feibel Cohen, because he was very close with Rav Yoshev. I mean, in the end, whatever suggestions we came up with, it was Rav Yoshev's response was basically nice try but no cigar, whatever. But it was just an interesting a snapshot of the history of the get law controversy that this committee existed altogether, and that we tried to make a tikkun at that point in time. A lot of the Shakla Vitaria is published in one of the early volumes, maybe Chelik Zayin or Ches of Yeshurun, if you want to read more about it. But leaving that aside, so I remember the prominent role that was played by Rav Feibel Cohen. So Rav Feibel Cohen asked the question of Rav El Yoshev regarding how much of a company would need to be owned by a Jew or Jews in order to be considered to be a Jewish entity, so that you would not have the Heter of Menachri Sashich, so it would be a loan of Ribbis Abami Lovel from a Jewish borrower from a Jewish lender to a Jewish borrower. So he answered the question, Ribbis. You asked a couple of questions, Binyan Ribbis. The second question is also interesting. It has to do with the sale of a mortgage loan, which Yetz Hashem will get to later in this month. But he says, with respect to this question, Milsa the Pshiti, the Bailam Emelo Etzlam Rovamanios. He says, Milsa the Pshita. This is already Pshita. He says it's the Dava Pashut, that you go after whoever owns the majority of the stocks. Where did he get it from? He said, it's Pashut from Rav Moshe. This tshuva that we read from Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe wasn't talking about Ribbis. He said something about a mida meruba, 15% being a problem for an individual. But in the course of his discussion, he spoke about, it's the majority people who make all the decisions. He quotes, and he gets to the last line where he quotes from Moshe, so he says quite clearly, this Rav Moshe is focusing upon Rov. I don't know. You can maybe distinguish between the cases. He was talking about when is it going to be a problem for an individual to own stocks in a company that does things that really aren't so correct. And he says, so you look at the majority, but the truth is, even an individual could get into trouble according to Rav Moshe if they own 15%. I don't know, but he says, Lemai says, since the decisions are made by the Rov, according to Rav Moshe's dicta, that he really just says in passing. So as a result, we can derive from this Rav Moshe that when we're dealing with a Ribbis transaction, we go after the Rov. And that seems to be the general approach that is followed, that we go after we're not based on, there were earlier poskim, they wanted to base on a brera. Yeah, well, if it's a loan that's coming to a Jewish person, so then we say based on brera that it's coming from the non-Jewish partners, it's not supposed to Jewish partners. Not saying based on that at all. He's saying that in terms of defining the essence of the entity, we're defining the essence of the entity based on the majority. It's a very, very interesting concept. Now, the one interesting thing as well, in dealing with the non-Jew, he said, so whatever restrictions once upon a time existed in terms of only loaning to a non-Jew for purposes of Chayi Nefesh. So we've gotten past that, and we're makel for even more than that in terms of loans to a non-Jew. But there's sort of the question that we discussed that there are certain heterim when it comes to somebody who's a mumar. Now, we would do those heterim also. We pretty much did away with and said it only would apply to a shanu pirish, and we really don't rely upon those heterim bisman azeh. And I brought it up in a b'diavad context, and even then it wasn't applicable. It's not generally going to be applicable, but the focus upon a Jew who might not be completely from comes up a lot in a different context, and that's the context of. And this is the next category I have of sort of the gimel, which is the Sofim Safsum Ochidin, that in terms of the shilos that Ribbis, you'll find that you're working as a businessman, you're working as a lawyer, and you're asked to participate in a Ribbis transaction. If the parties are not Jewish, no problem. But if the parties are Jewish, so then you got yourself a major problem, because not only do you generally have a lifnei iber problem, but whenever you have Ribbis d'oraisa for sure, even somebody who is serving as we said, the borrower himself violates lo sashich, not just lifnei iber, but violates an issa d'oraisa lo sashich. And even the Eidim violated the rights of Los Simun Olav Neshech, and even the Sofer, says the Shach, even the Sofer violates Los Simun Olav Neshech. So there's so you can't really get around that so easily. If I'm dealing with Ribbis d'Rabbanan, if it's Ribbis d'Rabbanan, let's say that you're machmir for the Minchas Yitzchak, and you hold that if it's a loan that's made to a Jewish company, even though there's only Shibu Nechasim, and it's definitely a Jewish company owned by a majority of Jews, even though there's only Shibu Nechasim, it's still going to be Ribbis d'Rabbanan. Well, Ribbis d'Rabbanan, we say the loba then is only over on Lifnei Iver. The Chabas Das goes so far as to say that's not only in the event that I'm talking about the loba, but even for the Eidim. Even for the witnesses also would only violate lifnei iver if it would be on a derabbanan level, not a deraisa level. He brings a raya from the Gemara, which truthfully I don't fully understand, in which it would seem that there was a Ribbis transaction, which we say that the Eidim might have. The Eidim did not violate an Isser Ribbis if they signed in this transaction, and the reason why we're assuming that is because it's probably only an Isser D'Rabbanan. I don't know why that case was only an Isser D'Rabbanan, but leave aside the raya. He says that the same thing would apply to the Eidim. So some of the poskim say this applies to everybody across the board. Maybe not the Arif, but certainly the Sofer as well. That the Sofer also, if it was only Ribbis d'Rabbanan, probably would only violate Lifnei Iber. And if you're a lawyer, you're going to be one of two things. Either you're going to be the Sofer. The Sofer is the worst thing you could be if you're a lawyer for this transaction. That means you're drawing up the documents. Rabbi Reisman has some very interesting, he says, what if he had a paralegal draw up the document and draw up the document himself? What if the lawyer drew up the document, but he left blanks? Then the parties filled in the blanks. I don't mean that the parties filled in the blanks. when I worked as a lawyer and I prepared documents, the things that would be like the blanks to fill in, the names of the parties, the amount of the loan, and the amount of the interest, those are like the most important things. Everything else was templates. Those are the most important things that they're relying upon the lawyer to draft correctly. So I don't know who would exactly leave that out. But if you left it out and somebody else filled in, let's say, the Torah, so to speak, is that considered serving as the sofer? There's a lot of very interesting questions. But at the very least, if you're the party that prepared the Bloomberg form of loan transaction, then people are using that form and they're filling in the blanks. Probably you're not considered to be the sofer when it comes to Ribbis transactions. That's probably the case. But very often, the lawyer is the scrivener. The lawyer is the one who's drafting the document. That could be a very serious issue of Ribbis Araisa, not only of Lifnei Iber territory, but of Losis Simun Olav Neshech. So if you're dealing with, number one, a Ribbis Araisa transaction and you're drafting the document, very hard to find the Heter for you. Very hard to find the Heter. Now, if your job is more as a sarasor, your job is more as a broker, you're facilitating the transaction, you're negotiating the transaction, you're doing those things, okay? So then the Shach says for the sarasor, the sarsur is violating an isser of lifnei iber. Even if it's Ribbis deraisa, we assume that for sarsur, it can't be worse than lifnei iber. Now, lifnei iber is also an isser. Lifnei iber is an isser deraisa. So how does it make it better if it's lifnei iber? Because lifnei iber, you have the potential heterim of chari b'denara. If it happens to be chari b'denara, that if you went into the work, they wouldn't find you as a lawyer, they'd find some other lawyer. There's a chumrah based on the Mishnah Melech that it would have to be that they could find a non-Jewish lawyer. It can't be just they find some other Jew who's going to violate the affair. They have to find a non-Jewish lawyer. But let's say they could find a non-Jewish lawyer. So then that's like the Nazir is asking for a cup of wine. He's not on a different island where you're the only person who can travel to the island to give him a cup of wine. He can find, so you're on the same island and there's plenty of wine available. He can get the wine from somebody else. That's called Chari b'denara. There's no daraisa violation with Ibir. But there is, according to many poskim, the Ramah that talks about this in Yoredei Siman Kuf Nun Aleph, not so long before we get to Hilchos Ribbis, that there is an Isser Misayeya. According to many Rishon, there's an Isser Misayeya that you're not allowed to help out, even if you're not the one who's directly enabling the transaction, but you're facilitating the Avera. So then that would still be an Isser D'Rabbanan along the lines of the Chiyuv that we all have to be Mafish Meisur, to separate every single Jew from committing an Isser. But once we are able to chop it down to Misayeya, so then there are Heterim when it comes to Misayeya. And the two most noticeable Heterim, and there's more, when it comes to 4 different Heterim, when it comes to Misayeya. One Heter is that of the Shach. The Shach in Siman Kuf Nun Aleph that says that Misayeya doesn't apply to 2 classes of people. It doesn't apply to a non-Jew, right? I'm selling things that could be used for Avodah Zarah, and if they didn't get it from me, they can get it from somebody else. No problem with Misayeh when it comes to a non-Jew. Number 2, there's no problem with Misayeh when it comes to a Mumar. So here we have the possibility of maybe relying upon this Heter of Mumar. Here, people are more prepared to rely on the Heter of Mumar and not worry so much about, well, maybe they're only a Tinuk Shinishba. Here, there seems to be more of a readiness among those the poskim to say, nah, Mumar outside of the category of the Issa of Misayeh. I'm not sure. That maybe that should be revisited, but assuming that would be the case, so that's one possible answer. If you're dealing with people who are not from, you're not actually drafting the documents, you're just facilitating, negotiating the transaction, somebody else could do it if not for you, it's not Jewish. So then there is the possibility of relying upon this idea that even if it would be Ribbis Daraisa, your role would only be Lifnei Iber, and it's already been whittled down to Misayeh, and the first people are not from. So then, with respect to Misayeh, there's room to be Mako. Furthermore, this might be a better Heter. There's the Heter of the Dogam Meravava. The Dogam Meravava, the Noda B'Yehuda, says, the Iker isn't whether the person's a Mumar or not. It can be from. The Iker is, are they doing it b'mezid or not? Are they doing it b'mezid? You're a lawyer. You say to the people, listen, you're both Jewish, and really, I have this thing known as Heter Iska, and this could avoid the Isuri Ribbis. Saying, we don't care about Isuri Ribbis. We don't care. We don't follow halacha. This is not something that we care about. So it's clear they're doing it b'mezid. So even if the people would be from, according to the Dagam Eravava, if they don't care about Hilchos Ribbis, you told them about Hilchos Ribbis, but it's clear that they're prepared to violate it b'mezid. So in such a case, then the Issa Misayeh would, according to the Dagam Eravava, it would not be applicable. There's a Meish Dava, there's an Itziv with a third Heter, who says that the Issa Misayeh only applies b'shas Aveir Mamish. But if you're sort of like doing things in the background, negotiating, facilitating before the loan actually is extended, so then the Issa Misayeh, according to the Netziv, may not be applicable. And finally, there is a Pri Megadim in Hilchos Netilas Yadayim, which the Mishnah Berurah quotes as well. The Pri Megadim says that once, if I'm only dealing with Ribbis D'Rabbanan, he didn't say Ribbis, if I'm only dealing with an Issa D'Rabbanan, if I'm only dealing with an Issa D'Rabbanan to begin with, since Misayeh itself is only D'Rabbanan, so to apply Misayeh to an Issa D'Rabbanan is a Gzeira the Gzeira. So if I'm only dealing with Ribbis D'Rabbanan, and maybe that's the whole reason why I was able to chop it down to Lifnei Iver, like with respect to the Sofer, assuming that we'd extend the Chavis Das's Svara when it comes to Edom, that it's only considered to be Lifnei Iver and Ribbis D'Rabbanan, like with a Lovet, and I would extend that to a Sofer as well. So even a lawyer who's drafting the documents, if it's only Ribbis D'Rabbanan, why would it only be Ribbis D'Rabbanan? Like I told you, you have a corporation, Jewish-owned corporation that's borrowing the money, where even if you don't hold like Ramosh, it's only Ribbis D'Rabbanan. You have some situation where it's only Ribbis D'Rabbanan. It's in some sort of a sale-purchase context where it would be Derech Mecher. It only be Ribbis D'Rabbanan. A lot of cases, I got to tell you, are Ribbis D'Oraisa. So like the shiloh that I got today, they seem to be Ribbis D'Oraisa. But if you can get it down to Ribbis D'Rabbanan, so then that's also consideration. So a lot of the shilohs that come along, you have to ask the questions, is it Ribbis D'Oraisa, is it Ribbis D'Rabbanan? Is the role that's being played that of a sofer, that is of a Messiah? You have to be very careful. Sometimes people come to you. This happened to me once. So I had a next door neighbor who was borrowing money from they were borrowing money from parents or something for purposes of being able to buy a home, and they needed witnesses. They knocked on our door, and they wanted me to sign it as a witness, and basically they were borrowing pounds in order to pay back pounds. Because they were like British or something, and it was a transaction here in America where it was a sa'a transaction, because British pounds in America is considered to be like payroll. So you can't borrow 20,000 British pounds to pay back 20,000 British pounds unless unless you actually have at least one a British pound. I don't know if they had it or not, but I said I didn't want to sign it. I didn't want to get involved in that as an aid, because then even if you sign a document, you could be, if it's a Ribbis transaction, then you could be guilty of lo sisim lo neshek, or even if it's that case was Ribbis D'Rabbanan, but there would still be a problem according to the Chavis Das on a Lifnei Iver basis. So you have to be so these shilas do come up. Okay, now, next very important principle. This is Gimel. Actually, it's the second Gimel. There were two Gimels, right? Okay, fine. So as we know, sometimes that happens. So Heter Schiras Avalot Schiras Kesef. So one very important principle, as I mentioned to you, is Ribbis is about Argoneter. It's about, basically, I'm charging rent for money. I'm not allowed to charge rent for money. Obviously, I could charge rent for everything else. Why can't I charge rent for everything else? I loan you I give you a shovel, you give me back the shovel, and you pay me money for it. That's called the rental. Why isn't that Ribbis? So the answer is it's not Ribbis because you're paying because there's some depreciation. Number two, it's still considered to be mine. I get to charge money when you're using my property. So then it happens to be my shovel. So I can charge you to use for the fact that you're using my property. That's considered to be legitimate, because I'm telling you, you're returning the same item. And under those circumstances, since it's I'm allowed to charge for what belongs to me. The thing with Ribbis, and the Siva Shalom explains this very beautifully. It says Rav Yosef Gelber, he says the thing with Ribbis is that I'm not charging for your use of my property. When you have the money, you can do whatever you want with them. It's not my property anymore. I have no right to charge for that. So Schiras is in a totally different domain, except when I'm dealing with money, because when I'm dealing with money, money is generally supposed to be used for spending purposes. It's not the same item that's being returned, and there's no depreciation per se, so you don't have these sevaros to rely upon. And the Gemara gives you a very pointed story about this. The Gemara really makes this very, very clear, explicit, because it tells you a story of an Amora who was renting out his money. He thought, you know what? I'm not lending the money, I'm renting the money. What's the difference between lending and renting? Well, if I lend, so a borrower is chayav onsin, But here, a borrower is chayav b'onsin, but a renter is not chayav b'onsin. So he said that it should be mutter because I'm taking. Said Rav Chama. Rav Chama said I'm taking responsibility for any onsin. If there's any kind of an accident that occurs with the money, so then I'm not entitled to get the money back. It's like any rental. So therefore, since I'm bearing a certain amount of responsibility, that's part of what we mean when we say that it's still mine, right? So I'm bearing a certain amount of responsibility. I take responsibility. There'll be depreciation. I take responsibility. I take the loss if there's going to be an onus as well. So he thought that would be good enough, but it turned out it wasn't good enough. Not only was it not good enough, it was viewed as a Ribbis deraisa. He lost all of his money because that's the halacha. If you lend out a Ribbis, you lose your money. You lose your money. Your fortune falls apart. So the Gemara asks, what's the difference between this and a shovel? Why is it I can rent out a shovel and I can't rent out money? So the Gemara gives the answer and how you tweak it. Within the two categories I discussed, the depreciation, the fact that it's chose be'enei. There's a discussion exactly how significant each of those factors are between Rashi and Tosas. We don't have time for it today, but the Gemara gives the basic explanation. Below that the number one, the shovel is returned itself. It never left the domain of the owner. And number two, there's depreciation. So Tosfos gives the simple explanation what Rav Chama was thinking. He thought that there's a difference between lending, where the borrower is responsible for everything, so shovel is responsible for everything, even onsin, and renting, where the borrower is not responsible for onsin, and that's why the lender thought that it would be perfectly okay, but it turned out that he was mistaken. Lu Yitzuyer, that somebody had $1 from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I wanted to show off, this is $1 that came from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I'm hosting a Lubavitch parlor meeting or something. So I figured that I'll get more support if I can show $1 from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So I asked my next door neighbor, hey, I have plenty of next door neighbors who are Lubavitch. So I asked one of them, I say, I'd like to borrow your $1 from the Rebbe because I'd like to show it off at the parlor meeting that I'm going to be hosting. Can I borrow it from I say, I don't want to borrow it. I want to rent it. I want to rent $1 and I'll even pay you for it. I'll pay you $2 to rent your $1. It's a good deal. I'll pay you $2 to rent your $1. Am I allowed to do that, or is that considered to be Ribbis? Perfectly fine. I'm not taking it for purposes of spending. It's not LHoraah nitna. I'm just going to keep it in my possession. The person's going to get back the same $1. If they'll get back the same $1, so then that would be perfectly permissible. Under these circumstances, obviously, I would not be allowed to take achrayas for onsin because with money, that's too dicey. But then this person who's renting it to me, he takes achrayas for the onsin. And I'm a regular renter. I take achrayas for gneva v'aveda, no problem. And I'm going to return the exact same $1. And I'm also going to pay for it. That's not considered to be ribbis because I'm not spending the money. And I'm not a borrower. We can see from the chiyuvim that I'm not a borrower. So under those circumstances, Shulchan Aruch says befeirush, that's okay. That's okay. The problem with the money is what the money is used for. The money is generally not intended to be returned to the lender. It's intended that I'm going to be spending the money and so forth. So Trumas Hadeshin is a wild notion. I only mentioned the Trumas Hadeshin because this really was the segue to Heter Iska. This was sort of the first idea, innovation of where you might come up with some sort of a guarantee for receiving your money. So Trumas Hadeshin said, I have a great idea. We'll just have people rent money. I said, you couldn't rent money? He said, no, look at Tosas. Tosas said the problem was that Rav Chama thought it was okay because he was responsible for onsin. What if Rav Chama would be responsible not only for onsin, but he would also take responsibility for gneva v'aveda? Oh, isn't that brilliant? He'll take responsibility for both onsin and he'll take responsibility for gneva v'aveda. So he says the implication of Tosas is then it would have been fine. Then it would have been perfectly fine. So he said, so I have a great idea. Have people just rent out their money. That the one who's renting out the money will take responsibility if there's onsin. He'll take responsibility if any of the money that's being spent around gets stolen or lost for gneva v'aveda. He'll even take responsibility. We'll throw in for good measure. He'll even take responsibility. The owner, the giver of the money, the lender of the money, well, really the one who's the owner who's renting out the money, will even take responsibility for pshia. We'll throw in pshia. Oh, wonderful. And then there is a sort of an expectation that the money will come back, and the person will pay a rental fee, whatever the rental fee is. He'll pay a rental fee for the money, and the only way that this individual will be off the hook will be in the event that he, or the only way that this individual, will not be off the hook, because otherwise the one who was renting out the money is taking responsibility for owning the name of Aveda and for Pshia, is if he'd be mazik. Mazik, of course, be mazik somebody's property. So obviously you're going to be chayav. So Trumas Hadeshin said, great. So we'll simply have the money rented out. And the only liability that the renter will have for the money is if he's mazik the money. But why should the owner of the money believe the renter that he wasn't mazik the money? In order for him to bring, he has to prove that he wasn't mazik the money. And the only way that he can prove that he wasn't mazik the money is if he brings the two individuals from the community who will serve as Eidim, who will testify that he was not mazik the money. And who are the two individuals? The Rav and the Shliach Tzibor. The Rav and the Shliach Tzibor, who know kind of what's going on in a general, vague sense, but it's pretty much a vadai, karav the karav the vadai shlo yedu kol achrayus. They're not going to know everything that's going on with respect to all the money that's being spent around. And in such a case, you would even be allowed to stipulate a sum. You could stipulate some. Well, instead of calling it ribbis, we'll call it a rental fee. Isn't that brilliant? And we'll do it with money. This was the Trumas Hadeshin's a brilliant idea. And of course, this is what translated later on. Trumas Hadeshin lived when? Like 1390 to 1416 or something like that. So the Trumas Hadeshin came up with this brilliant idea that sounds a lot like our Heter Iska, but it wasn't in the context of an Iska. It was in the context of renting money. Renting money. So you could rent money, and we're just going to say that the only chiyuv of the one who's renting it will be if he's mazik, but we're not going to believe him that he wasn't mazik. And in such a case, he would be obligated to pay back the money and to pay the rental fee for the money. To make it very secure that it's unlikely that we're going to have witnesses who will be able to say that that he was they will be able to say that he really kept the money properly and wasn't mazik the money. It'll have to be the Rav and the Shliach Tzibor. And then he says that we find, like with respect to Iska, we put all kinds of conditions in as well, that maybe we tell the person who's receiving an Iska that, and this is before we had the Heter Iska idea, that they're only going to invest it like in a certain way with precious jewels, and they have to store everything in the ground, even though we know that they're not going to do so. And if they don't do so, so then they're going to have a achrayus, and pretty much the principal is going to be guaranteed. So he said that we see that we have similar type devices in the context of Iska. He says, I know that's different. That's only Ribbis Drabanan because it's Karab, the Chaburah they have said, because there's only a guarantee of the principal, but if there aren't profits, so then the person who gave the Iska is not going to be guaranteed of profits. He didn't have this idea of a Skaris Pashrus at that point in time, but he said that, it's true that those cases were only talking about a problem in Drabanan, so I wouldn't rely personally upon what I'm saying if I'm dealing with the possibility of Ribbis Deraisa, where there's a ketzitza of an amount that actually has to get paid. But if there's no ketzitza, so there's what to talk about. So it's kind of interesting because he has this unbelievable kula, even though Lamaisa, he wasn't prepared to rely upon it, which is odd because it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch as Yesh Misha Omer that this is okay. Did he really say it's okay? He said it's okay, but he said, I wouldn't rely upon it. Okay. So the Trumas Hadeshin had this unbelievable kula. When it comes to actually applying it, he was only prepared to apply it to an Iska situation where there was no ketzitza. It was just a question of splitting profits, but not where there's a skaris pashrus that says, oh, we're going to guarantee a certain return because we're going to presume profit. So it's sort of interesting. So he was a progenitor of the Heter Iska, but he was, in the end, in the final analysis, he was a little bit less makel, but in the initial analysis, he was unbelievably makel. He was unbelievably makel. Who was it who really didn't like the Trumas Hadeshin school? None other than the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon on the side of the page of the Gemara, it quotes the Trumas Hadeshin, says lo nearly, but in the side of the Shulchan Aruch, he's a little bit stronger than that. Side of Shulchan Aruch, so here we have in the Shulchan Aruch, Bimkiba, this is, I think, the Ramah. Bimkiba alav maskir kol achrayos. If the maskir accepts upon himself all of the achrayos, bein the gneiver of the bein achrayos to own sin, yesh matirin afilu maskir lo tziam. So some say that it would be mutter to charge a rental fee, even if the person is going to be spending the money. So it's an incredible thing. It's not going to be giving back the same money, but nonetheless, you could charge a rental fee in this case. And he quotes from the Trumas Hadesh. And the Beragua quotes this. And the last words of the Beragua are very revealing. Mishtaka davar v'lo yomer. The Vilna Gaon says that this thing should be completely forgotten. It should never be mentioned whatsoever. I'm mentioning in Shir because the Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam mentions it. So how could it be Nishtaka Adavar? But it's not. But this idea of exploring the notion of renting money makes a lot of sense when you think about the fact that Ribbis is all about this distinction between you can rent out other items that depreciate, but you can't rent out money. Number one, it doesn't depreciate. And number two, it's meant to be used for spending purposes. It's no longer considered to be in the owner's domain. The chiddush is that even when, in the case of money, there is if it's meant to be spent, that is, if there is a complete assumption of responsibility on the part of the person who is giving out the money, that's still, since we don't know like the Trumas Hadeshin, it's not good enough. But the Trumas Hadeshin's idea when it came to rental really translated into what became the Maharam's wonderful innovation of the Maharam of Mendel Ben Avigdor's innovation. He was the Abbezin in Krakow, I think in the generation after the Ramah. So it's kind of an interesting thing. This doesn't find this way in the Shulchan Aruch, but very shortly after the Shulchan Aruch was published, they said the Heter Iska cropped up, and he used this idea of the Trumas Hadeshin to say, why don't we use this idea that we're only going to trust certain witnesses? We did away with the idea it has to be the Rab and the Shliach Tzibur, but there has to be like witnesses that are watching all of the transactions of this individual who are actually going to testify that the individuals that the money got lost. In order for the person who receives an Iska to be believed that he actually lost the money of an Iska. And that's the way in which we're basically going to proceed with respect to Heter Iska. The innovation was that we also kind of built in a profit, either guarantee or a profit period. With the original Heter Iska of the Maharam Avigdor was, the Maharam Ben Avigdor was the idea that it would be kulo pikadon. At the very beginning, it would be kulo pikadon until a certain amount of profit was earned, and then it would turn into a halva. The reason why later poskim didn't like that was because kulo pikadon is a little bit more, kulo pikadon is more difficult to continue. It's more difficult to continue after the initial period because with a lot of iskas, when the money's not paid, the iska just automatically continues. Here, it wouldn't be able to automatically continue because it's already been converted into a halva. So instead, they just made it into sort of next generation. After the Maharam Ben Avigdor, it was sort of translated into, I've seen you went through all this probably already. It was translated, or it was altered into this idea of a chatzi mil v'chatzi pikadon. But it really came from the Trumas, it really came from this idea of the Trumas Hadeshin. And it comes from this idea of the Trumas Hadeshin also, that the more responsibility that is maintained by the person who is giving out the funds, the more you can come up with these notions. So obviously, if I have full responsibility, like in a case of chatzi milva, chatzi pikadon also, this full responsibility. It's my pikadon, my deposit I'm giving to you. Anything happens to it, you're going to invest it, you lose the money, so I don't get anything back. So we figure out ways that I don't necessarily have to believe you that you lost the money, but it's a much cleaner proposition. It all comes from this idea of the Trumas of the Trumas Hadeshin. So that's the next major category. I'm not going to dwell on this category right now today because I know that Rabbi Bleich Shlita gave a shir on the Heter Iska and all the mechanics of the Heter Iska. So I'm not going to really spend too much time on that other than to make a couple of points with respect to the Heter Iska. One is the point of Moshe Feinstein, which is in source 25, Chelik Beis says Siman Samach Beis. He says, and this is in the bold, Mitzarach she'anosein lo yada lo yeda b'mahu osek. That it's very important when money is being given for Iska purposes, if the idea is that the investing partner, so to speak, is going to be guaranteed of his principal, including with respect to the pikadon portion, because he doesn't have to believe the managing partner that he actually lost the money unless he's able to produce witnesses. And Rav Moshe doesn't like the idea of having to produce witnesses, so he says maybe he'll produce like Edim Shakranim. He's not like so comfortable that there won't be lying witnesses who will say that we saw that a loss was suffered. We don't really worry about that, interestingly enough. Moshe was very worried about that. So Moshe said it should be a shvuah chamur for everything. That you need a shvuah chamura. He still assume people are not going to take a false oath. It'll be a shvuah chamura that the money was lost, and a shvuah chamura that the amount of a profit wasn't more than the anticipated amount of a profit. And if you don't have the shvuah shvua chamura in both of those categories, we're going to assume, number one, the money was lost. Number two, that the amount earned was at the very least the presumed amount of profits, so that the one who's the investing partner will get half of the profits, and he'll forgive whatever additional profits may have been earned as long as this amount gets paid. Which, by the way, the Skaris Pashtus is also another example of what we were saying earlier. If money is going to get paid not for Ribbis purposes, but based on presumed profit purposes in order to get out of taking an oath or something like that for some other purpose, so then we don't consider that to be in the category of Ribbis, even though, technically speaking, more than was given is being paid back. But here as well, you have the advantage of the fact that here it's not a question of renting out money. It's a clear-cut pikadon. It's a clear-cut pikadon that is the source of the earnings for the one who's giving out the money, which is 100% legitimate. It's not a harama whatsoever. It's not even Mexican Ribbis in that particular sense. But if the one who gave the money knows for sure that the money got lost, like for example, the money was given in the Heter Iska, just says it's being given for the purchase of certain real estate, and it's known that real estate went down in value. So then I don't need Eidim, I don't need a Shavua. I know it's an Anansadi. It's better than Anansadi. It's Ani Yodea. The person who gave the money knows himself that the money was lost, so then he's not allowed to collect. Then he's not allowed to collect. The Heter Iska has to be something very real. I mentioned that we had a case here in the CRC where there was a fellow in the community who borrowed money. It was an interesting thing because it was so weird. You can't assume that people remember halacha when they're engaged in their business transactions. These were people who, mamish, they were learning people. They would learn like in the morning and they would transact business in the afternoon. They had millions of dollars of loans going back and forth. Half of the transactions they forgot. They forgot to execute a Heter Iska. Half of the transactions, they forgot to execute a Heter Iska. There was these interest-bearing transactions. Half of them they remembered. There was like some Heter Iska form that was loosely included within the materials, whether fully filled out or not. Okay, so then you can be mako, you can infer, okay, we see that they intended for the Heter Iska to apply. But half of them, it was just no Heter Iska altogether. Most incredible thing. So obviously in those transactions, we said, I'm sorry, the lender is entitled to his principal, but he's not entitled to the Ribbis, simply not entitled to the Ribbis altogether. Said it was good the borrower defaulted and never got around to paying, the interest. According to Rav Moshe, if the total amount paid, even if there were interest payments, doesn't add up to the full principal, so it wasn't a violation of Ribbis. Some disagree. I mean, many disagree. But whatever. So Rav Moshe, according to Rav Moshe, at least there wasn't any payment of interest. And we said you can't collect interest in that case. But what was interesting is half of the cases the Wara Heter Iska said that the person who received the loans, he said, or received the Iska, he said, I'm prepared to take a shvua chamura. But Moshe said you can require shvua chamura in shul, during davening, you turn the lights off, you have candles lit, the whole production. He's no problem. He's prepared to take a shvua. And Lamaisa, it wasn't necessary for him to take a shvua because this was a case where the no saying yada, the no saying knew. Everybody knew this guy lost everything, all of his investments, every single investment under the sun. Everything went bad. It was an uninsided. The whole world knew about this. So in this particular case, we said, okay. Number one, he's prepared to take a shvua. We're not requiring him to take a shvua. But number two, this is very much an uninsided. So we're going to have a requirement for the chatzi milva, but not for the chatzi pikadon. So with respect to those loans. Anyway, but saksha nosin lo yada ma osek desh lo yada nosin be'asma ma shaya biyuchal lashpio miyada nosin ma osek avay efshe shiyada be'asma shayavsen o shlo yarevek lo shayak lashpio. You don't even need a shvua in that particular case. Us ve'muchak likak, you don't need Eidim, you don't need a shvua. Ve'yeh muchak likak pachos, and then he'll have to just take the chatzi milva. End of story. Imiyeh ma'at revek we got ma'afsid imiyeh hefsid. So this is a very important principle, and this is why all of the good standardized Heter Iska forms today, they all say when the money is being given, it's not being given for a specific Iska. It's being given so that the investor has a portion in all of the investments of the borrower. And for the most part, you're not going to be able to track down or have Eidim who know every single investment of the borrowers, and therefore there still would be a requirement to bring Eidim in order to prove Hefsed and to take a shvua in order to prove that there wasn't more of a revach that was earned than that which was stipulated, or that there wasn't a revach altogether. It wouldn't be so. In those cases, you would need Eidim and a shvua for those propositions because of the fact that the one who invested the money really doesn't know the full panoply example of the portfolio of the managing partner in which they invested all of their stuff. The more difficult cases the poskim are split on is when it's clear that the money is not being borrowed for investment purposes. It's being borrowed for personal purposes. A person needs the money in order to be able to pay their rent. A person needs the money in order to make a wedding. So in these cases, it's clearly not for investment purposes. So what the Imre Bina says, and this is, I think, Minagola, the Imre Bina says that, yeah, but when that money is received, it frees up other money so that now the other money that would have been paid in it would have gone towards investments can go freely towards investments. And by virtue of the investing partner giving this amount of money to the managing partner, the investing partner will stipulate that, because of the fact that this frees up an equal amount of money, so now I have a right, I have a share, I have a halfway share in profits and losses that relate to all of the investments that have been facilitated and enabled by the infusion of this money, even though we know that this money is going to be used for something else. That's much less controversial. The Sholem Eshiv's notion that the ability for a person to continue in their parnasa, that itself is an investment. I don't know, investment of what? An investment of their livelihood. Yeah, but we can see how much money they make in the parnasa. It's a difficult svara. That itself is now, because of the fact that they got this money, they can continue in their parnasa. Because they got this money, they can marry off their child, and now they're not going to have to pay for all the expenses relating to the child. Yeah, but how does that translate into profit exactly? It's a harder svara. So the Sholem Eshiv's approach, I think, was less accepted, but the Imre Bina's approach, I think, is a little bit more accepted. Now, the next thing that I wanted to speak about, which I touched upon briefly last time, so I'm going to touch upon it briefly this time as well, is the idea of the Heter Iska Klali. It's interesting. Somebody asked me recently, he said, Rabbi Reiss, I have a great idea. Why don't we just have every single person make a declaration that all of their loan transactions will be done according to Heter Iska, and this way we won't have any problems. That everybody will stipulate that every single one of their transactions, it's understood that when they're borrowing money, it's chatzi milva, chatzi pikadon. When they're loaning money, they're loaning it to another Jew for the purpose of chatzi milva, chatzi pikadon. Just have people make this declaration. I said, it's such a good idea that actually somebody else thought of it before. That was the great-grandson of Rabbi Kiva Eger, Rabbi Alter Azriel Meir Eger, who was the Abbezin of Lublin. So he came up with this wonderful idea, which is called the Heter Iska Klali. And in case you think that this is very far-fetched and outlandish, you find it, you look in I was looking in one of the Haredi newspapers a couple of years ago, and this idea was resurfacing. There were a bunch of Rabbanim, a bunch of distinguished Rabbanim and respectable Rabbanim who signed off on the notion that everybody should do this. Every year when they go to the Rav to sell their chametz, they should sell this Heter, they should sign this Heter Iska Klali form. I can tell you, it's not such a bad idea. Now that I experienced myself a din Torah here at the CRC, two very from learning Yidden, I got to tell you, this case that I'm talking about, these were mamish Talmidei Chachamim. They were Talmidei Chachamim, and half of their transactions, they forgot to execute a Heter Iska. I'm just telling you, Ma'aser Shahaya. So it's not really such a terrible idea when you think about this notion. The problem is that it may not work. Minor detail. May not work. Why doesn't it work? So the whole the premise behind it is that it's like a bodah, like you get up on Rosh Hashanah, all my nadarim are going to be b'telim miputalin. So that's one way that it works. And the second is kol ha'isa das rishona hu oseh. So Rav Aaron Kotler, his Mishnah Rabbi Aaron, the source 28 on page 7 over here. So he says that both of these notions are problematic, really for one fundamental reason. When you do a bittul modas, it's beino vein atzmo. So you're saying a neder that I'm going to take, so it's not really meant as a neder. Anything I'm going to do in the future is based on my initial das, but there's no chavla kamina. There's no other party. There's no third party who's involved in this stipulation. This only affects this individual, not any other second party or third party. It doesn't affect any other individual. But once there's another party, that party has to buy into it. If they haven't bought into it, what difference does it make? The borrower says, oh, it's a Heter Iska. I didn't loan you money with a Heter Iska. It's nice. You thought there was a Heter Iska, but I never made this Heter Iska Klali declaration. And it's not a Heter Iska. And even if both parties will make the declaration, sounds a little bit from Aaron, he says, even if both parties make the declaration, to say that something that you're doing is kol osa das rishona hu oseh, that's when you're doing something bestam. That you made a declaration at the beginning, and now you just do something which is vanilla and boilerplate. So we say you intended all of the conditions that were from before. Well, what you're doing right now is in direct opposition, contradiction to what you said before. Very difficult to argue. I said everything is going to be an Iska. And then I sign all these papers saying, oh, I'm borrowing money and it's tied onto the LIBOR interest rate in London. And What are you talking about? How is that a chatzi milva chatzi pikaron? You're writing explicitly that you're doing something different. You're writing explicitly that you're borrowing money and you're going to pay with interest. That's what you're doing. That's not kol osa das we should have osa. So he said it's very, very difficult. If b'shas meiser, it's one thing to have something which is a bittul that you do a bittul modos, but to be mavato what you do, but to create a chalos of an iska, you can't create a chalos of an iska unless everybody says that this is really going to be an iska. And particularly if you say that it's something exactly the opposite, very, very difficult to make that argument. But it's interesting that Moshe Feinstein seems to have reversed himself on this particular subject. At one shuva in Shnas Tafshin Lamed Aleph, which he was asked actually by people in England, does it make sense to do a Heter Iska Klali for banks? He said, no, you can't do that. Heter Iska Klali for banks? What are you talking about? First of all, and Heter Iska talks about Eidim, and they're going to accept Eidim or not Kasherim. And secondly, it would have to, the Heter Iska Klali applies to all the borrowers. You can have non-Jewish borrowers together with Jewish borrowers. And obviously, you don't need it for the non-Jewish borrowers, it'll only be the Jewish borrowers. And they're not going to take very kindly to distinguishing between the Jews and the non-Jews. So just practically speaking, he says that you can't really do this. He says, you can rely on my other Chiddush, that if you're loaning to a corporation, so you don't need a Heter Iska altogether, but he says, otherwise, I'm not comfortable with this. And then 4 years later, I don't know what happened. He says, Mamish, 4 years later, Yeshnas Tafshin Lamed, he writes a tshuva saying, oh, you have a bank, you want to do a Heter Iska Kali, here's how you do it. Now, maybe because he was talking about America, maybe he felt in America, you don't have these same tensions, you don't have the same problems. I don't know, but he said, this is no problem. You could do it in America. This is a tshuva that he wrote to his son-in-law, by Moshe David Tendler. So he wrote this tshuva that he felt that this was actually something that would work. Why would it work? He said the reason why it works is because when you have a bank, their Heter Iska Klali makes sense. Because every single person who enters into a transaction, they know that they're entering into it subject to all of the rules and regulations of the bank. That's like understood. It's like built in. It's like when somebody goes to the Beth in America, they sign the arbitration agreement and they say, I am accepting upon myself all the rules and procedures of the Beth. The rules and procedures of the Beth are not written in the document. It's a separate standalone document, but they're incorporating it. So here, all of the rules and regulations of the bank are automatically incorporated in any transaction of the bank. So therefore, that's something which is mimela, and both parties go in with their eyes wide open. He suggests it's something that should be publicized, hung on the wall. This may have been, there was a bank in Muncie that was owned by Frum Yidden, and they had a giant Heter Iska that was hanging on the wall. Could be this was the case that was being described by Rav Moshe. So it's something that even though if it wasn't hanging on the wall, if it's something which is accessible, you look up the resolutions and the regulations of the bank and you would find it. So therefore, it's understood that the parties are accepting this upon themselves. Now, Rav Moshe says that normally it's necessary, parties enter into an Iska, they have to understand what the Iska is all about, but presumably the Heter Iska Klali, if it's available, so they have the ability, if it's spelled out, more than just the words Al Pi Heter Iska Shel Maram, but it's actually spelled out. This is how the Heter Iska works. This is that it's Chatzi Milva, Chatzi Pikodon, and it's the losses and the profits are split evenly, and there's a Schar Tircha, and the Schar Tircha, very important to pay, because otherwise you have Ribbis that the managing partner is doing work on behalf of the investing partner when it's a Chatzi Milva without getting reimbursed for it. So that's why you have to have the payment. But he says payment, no problem, $1.50. When Moshe was comfortable with 50 cents, you have some amount that's paid, important that it get paid. So that was the case of Rav Ilish in the Gemara, where Rav Ilish apparently had an Iska, and then when they found it afterwards, and after he died, so it didn't say that there was a Schar Tircha that was being paid. So he said, Rav Ilish is another, is a Gava Rabbah, for sure that would have been, and this amount would have been incorporated, that it would be divided, if not in terms of payment, you can have it work another way, which is that the managing partner receives 2/3 profits and only shares 50% in losses, or he only has to pay the 1/3 of the losses, and he shares 50% in the profits. You could do it that way. So however you draft this, they said that's obviously what Rav Ilish had in mind. So when we had this in Torah, so one of the Toadim had a very interesting, one of the parties who brought along sort of their halachic advisor. So they made a very interesting suggestion. They said, based on Rav Ilish, here we're dealing with two. So obviously, even if there was no Heter Iska, it's considered like it's Mimela that there should be a Heter Iska. I didn't think that was a good svara, because in the Mavilish case, it's not a contradiction to the document. Because the document says it's an Iska, and typically in Iska, so there is an allocation of the profits and losses in this particular fashion that the managing partner is going to get more. If you enter into a transaction, you say explicitly, the one like Rav Yona was saying, you say explicitly that everything is going to be subject to interest being paid and so forth, and there's no suggestion of Iska whatsoever. You have to fill in the blank and say that they change the entire structure and nature of the transaction. It's going to supersede the terms of this document. To make that much of a jump, I think is too much. In terms, even if I'm dealing with two Talmidei Chachamim, we didn't feel comfortable being able to make that inference. Okay, but if you do have a Heter Iska Klali that governs all of an institution's activities, so then it's much more feasible to make this argument. And what I included in the materials was, number one, the standard form Shtar Iska of the Beis Din America, so you can refer to this and feel free over the course of the year to improve it, because it could probably benefit from a little bit of improvement. It has a sort of a funny language. I don't know why we haven't changed it over the years. Probably we should. Where people were like wondering, is it like really saying that there's a possibility of bringing Eidim or taking a Shavuah? Does it just say that the amount of presumed profit is going to be paid up front? It says the said blank, who's the ones who receives the funds, has agreed that in lieu of such sharing of profits and losses, which would require substantiation of the losses by two trustworthy witnesses and verifications of more profits by oath, he shall accept my payment of an annual percentage, meaning the investing partner has agreed that he will accept my payment of an annual percentage, a blank of the said sum and waive all other profits. Now, the way in which this agreement is interpreted, and I think it's the meaning of the document, but it's not like perfectly drafted in my humble opinion, is that it would require, and therefore it could be done. It would require, yeah, it's true. It would require substantiation of losses by true trustworthy witnesses. You want to do that Gegus and Day. It would require verification of all profits by oath. That's perfectly feasible if you really want to do that. If the managing partner really wants to do that, but the managing partner decides for whatever reason he's not going to do that. So then the investing partner will accept the payment by the managing partner of the annual percentage of the presumed profits that relate to the chelik hapikadon. So okay, I think it's certainly, and people have written on this. I have a Chaburah who wrote a book on business halacha who made reference to this document. He said, yeah, doesn't love the language, but he thinks it works. So I think that since we realize that it works, so the general approach is don't mess with something that works. But I don't know, maybe with a little bit of tweaking, it could be made just a little bit more clear. I don't know. So something to think about. Then I have a nusach Heter Iska Klali that we got from one of the major banking institutions. And of course, I referred to it last time, so I'm not going to go into it again. The Yeshiva University form, Heter Iska Klali, that seems to live somewhere in cyberspace, but it does come to life whenever a student asks for it and the general counsel's office refers them to me and says, yeah, we have it. I know they have it because they sent it to me. So, okay, good. At least Baruch Hashem, there's something. So I want to just, I think, conclude here because we've reached the hour and a half point. There is another very important inyan with respect to Ribbis transactions when it comes to non-loans and commercial transactions of when Ribbis is applicable, when it's not applicable in terms of two-price systems, in terms of credit transactions, in terms of prepayments, in terms of discounts, and things of that variety, where there's a major distinction that is drawn between goods on the one hand and what would be sachar, the payment to an employee who has already begun working, or schirus of a property where a two-tiered system is considered to be more permissible. And the reason for that, and this is anybody who's learning Daf Yomi, it's going to come up in the next couple of blot of the Daf Yomi, very, very important principles of what is the real price and what is considered to be the variable price. If the real price is the higher price, and you can say a discounted price is really something that's not the real price, there's more room to be makel. If the real price is the lower price, and then somebody is paying more, either in terms of money or in terms of goods later on, so then you're going to have Ribbis issues, but to all kinds of very interesting, fascinating exceptions. I just wanted to, make a notation of that, because that will come up in many, many contexts of non-loan type transactions, or where you have two parties who want to enter into something that otherwise would have been a loan transaction. They restructure it along these lines. This has to do with concepts of psika and huzla and all of those, and parsha, that are very, very important to understanding the real life applications of Hilchos Ribbis in many, many different situations. But if you already have situations where you're being asked to prepay for items or you're being given discounts for paying something upfront, so just bear in mind, if it's real property, probably, and you're making a kinyan, you're in better shape. If it's an item that has not yet been received or delivered, so then you're in more dangerous shape. And we'll just leave it at that. And there are many, many different rules and exceptions. And where a poel fits in is also an interesting question. But basically, you have to be makbid if the poel hasn't started their work, and more makeup if the poel has started their work. And those are the basic principles. So now we have laid out sort of the landscape in terms of the basic principles and basic concepts that will come up throughout Hilchos Ribbis in different ways, shapes, and forms in terms of how we characterize the Malva, how we characterize Lova, how we characterize Ribbis, how we what are the major either workarounds or solutions when it comes to Ribbis, and we will, Yetzer Hashem, over the course of the year, speak about much more specific applications at great length to see how all this plays out in the modern age. Are there any questions before we wrap it up for the day?
Thank you, Chaburah. This was great. Thank you for being available for part 2.
Okay, sure. It is my pleasure. I want to wish everybody a kasiva, v'chasima tova, a good gebench year. Okay.
Next week is Rabbi Willig at 3 o'clock on Tuesday.
Right, take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Chaburah. Thank you.